team does not adequately explain how on earth Prigozhin was going to win the war they would like him to campaign on. Because the only mechanization they ever give is just to say, as Prigozhin moves throughout the Russian countryside, more troops would just join them, as though the Wagner Group is not mostly just comprised of conscripts who are forced to be there, as though this is not a group that wreaks devastation in their wake as they move through the Russian countryside. Clearly, it is not a group which is popular, and it is especially not a group you would join if you have been raised in a culture of fearing Putin. And then they also say that they get to accumulate more resources. But in the same breath, they identify that the Wagner Group is one that Russia has been choking out slowly, has had a lot of resources provided to it by the Ministry of Defense. They never explain why they can access weapons manufacturers. They never explain why they can access increased supply lines. They never explain how on earth the Wagner Group would be able to deal with the expanding borders of the front of war they are fighting on. On that basis, this is a fundamentally unsuccessful war. And we would point out to you that at the point at which Prigozhin surrendered, he was able to acquire some leverage. He did have control over some territory. We would point out that was the maximum capacity of this army. And it was at that point that Prigozhin used his leverage to negotiate a deal which resulted in his own safety. Let's start by looking at the counterfactual in this debate. We would identify that the deal in this debate was obviously made midway through the incursion, of course. And what that means in this debate is we think that this is happening in the midst of the conflict. What that means that their side, they want to defend continuing to progress in the war, but we would observe two responses to this. The first thing we would say here is it is actively just not in the interest of Prigozhin to win the coup. And that's for a few reasons. The first is to identify that Prigozhin, contrary to what side affirmative says, is not actually a military man. He is overwhelmingly a businessman who used to work in the restaurant industry, proposed the concept of the Wagner Group to Putin at a dinner, and nowadays obviously uses the Wagner Group not just as a military force, but also to do things like reap the rewards of cobalt mines in the Democratic Republic of Congo. So this is an individual with a high amount of offshore wealth, for example, that's largely stored in banks in the UK and in Switzerland, an individual who has access to a vast variety of resources that they would be able to leverage to continue to live a good life. And this is a team who says that Prigozhin now exists in a jail. Yet, fair enough, but that jail is the size of the whole world minus Russia. This is clearly a totally acceptable alternative, and we think it is obviously far preferable than the one this team proposes of suicide, because the only mechanism they ever give is just to say that this is an individual with a high amount of honor. No further analysis given as to why the overwhelmingly existential threat of suicide would ever be an unacceptable alternative for this individual. So we would say Prigozhin coup for a few reasons. The first thing we would say is that the coup occurred because of reactions against the Ministry of Defense for cutting funds and for actually being belligerent towards the Wagner Group. And that's a piece of context which deeply suggests that the form this invasion is likely to take is probably one which is incredibly unsuccessful insofar as this continues far into the future. But we would also observe that there was quite a long time where Prigozhin only would criticize Shoigu and not Putin. And that we would observe that only once Putin threw his weight behind the Ministry of Defense that the coup occurred. We would point out that this is an indicator that Prigozhin needed a way to extricate himself from this coup. He probably took a small territory to hold the leverage over Putin, as this team identified, but it does not mean that he is likely to be successful long into the future. That, we suggest, is for 6 reasons. The first is that obviously Prigozhin loses the element of surprise insofar as he attempts to march on Moscow. Because obviously this isn't, the first steps of the coup are the easiest insofar as Russia and its military is unable to react. But at the point at which you're aware that this is a conflict which is happening, that becomes much more difficult. The second thing we would say is, as their own team observed, the Wagner forces were largely weakened in Ukraine for the reason that they were firstly largely on the front lines of the battle, and secondly, for the fact that the Ministry of Defense is often limiting supplies and resources to them. The third thing we would say is that the Wagner soldiers would generally be relatively unwilling to engage in this process, or would probably substantially lose morale, for the reason that they are actually overwhelmingly just Russian conscripts, and who would feel particularly disenfranchised fighting against the body which captured them in the first instance. The fourth thing we would observe is a geographical mechanism, which is just to say it's really difficult to march on Moscow for the reason that it's like the entire west of Russia is overwhelmingly plains-land, which means it's really easy to see you coming, and it's really easy to fight a very large-scale war, which is obviously in the advantage of Russia, who has a far greater military capacity. And the final thing we would say is that, as this team themselves identified, Ukraine is closing in behind the Wagner Group for this coup. So they are actually fighting a war on both fronts to maintain the territory they hold, not just from Russia, but also from Ukraine, which means that this is a particularly delicate situation. The final thing we would say is that we think that this is clearly an existential threat politically and just in terms of militarily for Putin if it were the case that Prigozhin would succeed, which means that he would be incredibly likely to throw all the resources Russia has towards putting down this coup. And we would observe that Putin historically has been incredibly concerned with respect to his own personal well-being. That looks like things like, for example, maintaining body doubles, having food testers, etc. And we think this is a pattern of behavior that suggests most elite Russian troops are probably still located in Moscow to avert an eventuality exactly like this one. So this is a group of understaffed Russian conscripts fighting against one of the most well-resourced and most well-trained sets of troops in the world. Clearly, it is not one which is particularly likely to succeed for this side of the And that means it is a clear win for side negative in this debate. Because we, in the first instance, explain why even if you believe this deal is like probably kind of bad, even if you think this deal is not the greatest negotiation that ever could have occurred, it is clearly far better than the alternative of military loss, of death or Prigozhin, of an inability to access any of the resources this individual has spent their entire life working for. Clearly, the debate falls to side negative. But the second issue in the speech is just going to explain why this deal is one which is particularly good and particularly utile for Prigozhin. The first reason we would say is that in the political sense, it does just help keep Prigozhin alive for the reason that Putin has made an agreement not to do things like prosecute this individual. And their team makes a natural observation that maybe Putin could just violate his word. But we would suggest this is unlikely for the reason that the agreement is specifically with the country of Belarus, who Russia maintains as a global ally by continuing to deal contracts with, by continuing to honor and uphold those agreements. We think that insofar as this is intermediated through that body, it is deeply unlikely Russia would do things like violate Belarus's sovereignty in the way that they would require for their powers to eventuate. But we would also suggest that there are three additional structural reasons why Prigozhin is far safer as a consequence of the deal. The first thing we would say is that due to the fact that they are in Belarus, this would involve Putin sending an entirely new front of individuals in order to access Prigozhin within that state, which means that it is something which is relatively difficult to do. And we would additionally say that Putin's intelligence apparatus within Belarus is obviously comparatively weaker to that within Russia itself. The final thing we would say is that we don't think Putin is actually that scared of Prigozhin as an individual, but rather scared by the largesse and mass of the Wagner Group writ large. What that means is that in a world where this deal is signed, and much of the Wagner Group is either decommissioned or absorbed into Russia, and Prigozhin is separated from individuals of the Wagner Group, Putin actually has very little active incentive to pursue Prigozhin in the way that this affirmative team would rely on. That means that our world is the one where this individual perhaps, does not live the greatest quality life ever, but is in an environment where they are relatively safe, able to enjoy their faculties of life, and access the overwhelming amount of wealth they have accumulated. And we would know that the evidence this affirmative team has to work with to suggest that the deal has been violated is vanishingly low. It is literally the least probative piece of evidence ever, where Lukashenko has just said, well, we saw somebody who may have been Prigozhin in St. Petersburg. Very little evidence to suggest why it would be this individual. We would suggest it would be incredibly stupid to leave the amnesty of that deal, and we think that this is clearly a deal where Prigozhin is the foremost beneficiary of. For those reasons, proud to negate.
Thank you. Thank you for that speech. We now call on the second affirmative speaker.
Wait, if I speak at this volume, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
I would rather not use my
Are your sheets of paper okay? Maybe not.
not really. It's okay. It's fine. I'll work something. Kasa? Okay. The question I want you to ask yourself, panel, is what did Prigozhin get from this deal? Because the only thing he got was an assurance of immunity from prosecution for the coup that he started in the first place. Clearly, Prigozhin wanted more for Wagner from this agreement, but he got cold feet linked first before the cards were even on the table for him to assure anything from his forces. The first thing I want to explain is why Prigozhin had significant amounts of leverage over Putin in this snapshot in history. The first is Wagner's military capacity is just much larger than the MOT because they have more manpower, the individuals there are more hardened and well-trained with more experience, and also they have access to advanced weaponry. But it's not just the military capacity of Wagner, but also the fact that the Russian military strategy was to put Wagner in key military locations meaning that there was significant leverage where the Russian military was reliant on Wagner for strategic points in the Ukraine war. Given the context of Ukraine gaining ground in the counter-offensive with more commitment from Europe and US for weapons and machinery, Russia could not afford any disruption through an increase in the offensive from the Ukraine. Therefore, they were likely going to agree to things that Wagner wanted in the first place, because any disruption where Wagner pulled out of key military locations would be severe and detrimental to the Russian war effort. Therefore, even if it's the case that there were weakness in the Wagner Group, the time-sensitive nature where Putin could not afford for any disruptions given the gaining forces of the Ukraine counter-offensive meant that Putin would have been quick to cut a deal with Wagner. But it was not just about Wagner as a military group. It was also the fact that Wagner is a key part of the Russian geopolitical strategy to gain influence. Wagner is active in many African nations like Mali, where they help authoritarian leaders entrench power in exchange for money and resources. If Russia lost Wagner, they would lose all their connections and influence to all of these other nations. They desperately needed all of these connections because Russia's economy is increasingly tanking from all of the global sanctions. Therefore, the only way in which they were able to keep their economy afloat was through all of these economic connections and sphere of influence, which were tied together with the Wagner military group. Therefore, there is a geopolitical incentive for them to have listened to Wagner as well. But furthermore, the Russian military is just fatigued with low morale. People are upset at the military spending and the conscription of citizens. Putin's options were limited, and therefore he had to cut a deal with Wagner quickly. They said that Putin might respond with military might, but they simply did not have the resources or political capital to stamp out the coup or the incursion, because they did not want to dedicate more resources to stamping out Wagner when they were already losing the Ukraine counter-offensive. But the last thing to note here is that Prigozhin's criticism was resonant with the Russian public. Therefore, it confirmed the fears that this was an unjust war and that people ought to be against Putin. Therefore, Putin desperately needed to rein Prigozhin in to limit how much effect Prigozhin had on Russian support for the war. All of these structural reasons suggest that the specific nature of this interaction and the position of Russia and Wagner meant that it was the most optimal situation for Prigozhin to strike a good deal with Russia. The conclusion, therefore, is that even if Putin is a strong man, and that's why Prigozhin got cold feet on their side of the house, this does not mean that you will not extended the deal towards Wagner. If we push the envelope further, we would have been able to get a better deal. We know Putin would have considered this because the way that this situation has unfolded already shows Putin acting in uncharacteristic manners. For example, he initially said when the coup broke out that Prigozhin is a traitor and that he will punish Prigozhin harshly, but then afterwards he immediately retracted those statements and granted immunity to Prigozhin. That is clear evidence that Putin has lost the leverage and therefore is no longer the strong man that we previously perceived him to be. But even if it was true that Wagner was getting tricked out and is unpopular, which is the main response coming from their side of the house, this debate happens in a specific snapshot in history where Russia was weaker comparatively and was in a worse position because of the Ukraine counter-offensive. But here's the flip. If it was true that Wagner was getting tricked out and losing military support and losing ammunition, this was the most perfect time for them to have a deal with Putin, because any subsequent moment where they were trying to push a deal for Putin would have been one where they would have less resources afterwards. Therefore, the position of Wagner is the highest right now, which meant that if there was any ability to get a better deal, it would have been on outside of the house. But this was simply not true that Wagner was unpopular or lacked military capacity. The forces are made of hardened veterans that deeply respect Prigozhin, and it's evident from how quickly he managed to mobilize people to walk the march to Moscow. But therefore, the conclusion at this point in my speech is that we would have likely got a better deal. But it was not just about the positive benefits of getting a better deal from Putin. This deal on their side of the house that they struck had active harms to the Wagner forces and morale. Many of the troops that agreed to join the coup and join the march to Moscow felt as if it was pointless because the eventual deal that they struck just returned them to status quo anyway and resulted in Prigozhin being locked up in St. Petersburg. No Wagner troop trust that they will get immunity, and they see Putin as someone who's paranoid and holds grudges, and therefore feel as if they did not benefit from Prigozhin striking this deal with Russia. So this hurt the Wagner's good morale and had active harms when they agreed to this. A better deal would have looked like getting an agreement to immediately stop attempts of the MOD to pull Wagner into the main forces. More commitment from Russia to increase support for Wagner groups in key military locations. It looked like giving Wagner troops a safe haven in a country that was not Russia aligned like Belarus. But even if we did not get an immediate deal from Russia, we would have been able to get more time to negotiate and get more concessions and have more discussions. When the coup broke out, in less than 24 hours, Prigozhin then agreed to the agreement, which is clear evidence that he blinked too quickly instead of allowing the pressure to accumulate even more, which would have put more political pressure on Putin to make him consider more concessions towards Wagner. But even if you don't buy that we would have got a better deal, accepting Lukashenko's terms was the worst possible option because Belarus has been historically trying to cozy up to Putin. Even if you believe that Putin somehow has the capacity and the political capability to crush the coup on their side of the house, it would have been better to defect to the West in a cushy prison rather than the possibility of torture and death in St. Petersburg. The West would have embraced him and he would have been, because his vital information about the Russian military forces, but he will also be seen as a hero who stood up against the imperialist Putin. So even if Russia wanted to crush these military forces, there was an escape not on our side of the house where he could have deflected to the West instead, as opposed to the current precarious position that he's in, where we're not even sure if he's alive or if he's going to get tortured. The worst case scenario on our side of the house is that Prigozhin dies in this coup. But we told you then this was an acceptable trade-off on our side of the house. It was better than the alternative of torture that he would likely succumb to on their side of the house. Their side said, we have no evidence that Putin will torture or go back on his agreement. But clearly, if you look at the case of Navalny, he has done these things where he said that he would not torture or not kill this individual, but then have rained on those promises again. So there is evidence to suggest that we should be wary of Putin when he makes certain promises to individuals. We told you about the dignified death of standing up to Putin, standing up to Putin and fitting of a military man like Prigozhin, rather than what we see now. Prigozhin is a humiliated general right now that has lost the respect of his troops because he has agreed to a suboptimal deal where the troops have perceived him to having more leverage. What do we win on at the end of this speech? The first thing is that we have proved that we have got a better deal which will improve Wagner's position, which is important in improving the situation of the troops on the ground and restoring morale to get people to join Wagner. If it was true that Wagner is currently unpopular, what they needed to do was to restore the trust in Prigozhin. And in order to do that, they had to prove that Prigozhin was someone that was not under the thumb of Putin, but someone that could assure the benefits to the Wagner forces. He did not do that when he came to the Russian pressure. But the second thing is that even if the deal, it was not only the case that this deal was suboptimal, but it was actively harmful to individuals where it hurt morale and eventually locked Prigozhin up in the hands of Lukashenko, when now he's at risk of getting tortured, as opposed to outside of the house where he still maintained avenues to be able to enter the West. But not the most important, like the last ability which will take them out of this debate, is that even if the coup went wrong, this would be preferable on outside the house. Because at least he would have been able to die a dignified death and maintain his military might. And note the important thing for Wagner forces here, which is that even if, because he's a military man, his primary concern is not just his ability to stay alive, but also his legacy and his ability to inspire hope in the Wagner troops. The ability for him to do this is lost at the point in which he's humiliated. It showed that he's lost leverage against Putin, and it showed that Putin was able to crush him under his thumb and force him to a subpar optimal agreement where he was not able to achieve any benefits for the Wagner forces.
Thank you for that speech. We now come on the second negative speaker.
Can I be heard? I thought we were doing 3v3 debating, but turns out we're doing BP, because PM goes like, well, we're gonna take the throne and fight to the death. But then at CG, apparently they case shift all the way to this tiny little model of, we'll fight a tiny little bit more so we can get a tiny better deal and then claim all of your benefits and be on the strategic upside. Unfortunately, this damns their whole team's case in 3 ways. Firstly, they never proved that this is likely to be successful, because we explained that it is not just Prigozhin that is the threat, it's the Wagner Group as a whole that is the threat. And at the point at which that group is militarized and showed a propensity to be able to throw a coup, obviously Putin will not rest unless that group is disbanded, which means that the disbanding of the Wagner Group is likely to be a non-negotiable term of the deal that they can never prove under their side. Secondly, this means that they killed all of the harms they explained of Putin possibly reneging on the deal, because they're apparently still supporting the deal on their side. And lastly, all of their benefits become massively speculative, because it is speculative whether they'll continue to win the war, and it is also speculative whether Putin would actually react in the ways they want. It's likely every day you keep fighting, Putin maybe decides to just double down and crush the Wagner Group completely as he sees it as more and more of an existential threat. And each day of extra fighting is another day that this man lives in terror and fear, because he might get assassinated, he might get drone struck while he's an active threat to Russia. We're the only side that guarantees his safety, because the info side has given us that form of fear that he is alive right now. That is why we win this debate. The first issue is, could Prigozhin win a coup? Given that Jackie explains and said that Prigozhin obviously values life, the burden for their side is very high, because they have to prove an overwhelming likelihood of success rather than just maybe a chance of success, because generally a chance of success doesn't really justify why you would sacrifice your life to go into a war. They say the Wagner Group has a lot of leverage. We explain that this is true, but that leverage was momentary because that leverage was built on the fact that it was an element of surprise because Russian troops obviously didn't expect the Wagner Group and their own forces to turn against them. And because the reason why the Wagner Group was disgruntled in the first place is because the Ministry of Defense was withholding resources from them, which meant that ability to ration their own forces, the ability to supply their own forces was steadily running out, which means you only had a short-term window of leverage, which is why we made the deal rather than waiting longer and fighting longer. Then they say, well, the Wagner Group is important because there's a sphere of influence. This is a cost that is already likely sunk because, as I explained in my introduction, if you take a deal later, it's not like Putin's going to welcome you with open arms and be like, yeah, Wagner Group can keep doing geopolitical things in Africa. Obviously, at the point at which this group has demonstrated an actual threat to Putin, Putin's not going to allow that threat to continue and is likely to disband that group. Thirdly, they say, well, the disruption of the Wagner Group is detrimental, not because the Wagner Group is strong in fighting the coup, but that they're important in the frontline key choke points of the war, and that if you pull them, then you start losing the Ukraine war. This doesn't prove why he will win the war, it only proves why he's important in the course of the war, given that you need to actually prove that mere lack of participation isn't enough because we're still, at the same place, which is to say, yeah, you pull away your troops, and yes, this causes some damage, but until you're actually able to win the war, you're unable to extricate yourself out in a way that actually benefits your safety. Jackie provides 6 important mechanisms of why you're unlikely to fight the war in an effective way, why you're unlikely to sustain a coup, but let's just think about the nature of the Wagner Group. Because firstly, the way that the Wagner Group is established is obviously as a paramilitary group, and any government does not establish a military group that is big enough to overthrow them. That is why even in the conventional military, they separate the military into divisions and divide them up to different, say, political leaders and all that kind of stuff. The second thing to say, and this is the thing that they really shoot themselves in the foot in, the Wagner Group does have a geopolitical purpose all around the world. And the reason why it's important is that because it's a paramilitary group, what Putin can do is use the Wagner Group to obfuscate responsibility. For example, if the Wagner Group holds a coup somewhere or they commit some war crimes, Putin can be like, no, that's not me, that's a paramilitary group. That explains why the Wagner Group has to be very small, because they're operating and doing things that are necessarily against things like international law. They're doing things and trying to avoid and obfuscate accountability, which is why this group is likely quite small and not particularly large. Lastly, we explain to no response that the Wagner Group is highly decentralized, because they're made up of profit-seeking former convicts who only care about money that has dried up since the military of defense has failed to pay them. And immediate conscripts apparently from the towns that they capture along the way, not the most highly motivated force. And this also exposes a crucial vulnerability in this plan, because Russia doesn't even have to beat the Wagner Group. All they have to do is send a drone or assassinate Prigozhin while he's marching towards Moscow. And if they kill him, because the only commonality amongst the Wagner Group is that Prigozhin is lenient, they just literally destroy the whole force. It's not like, for example, if you assassinate the leader of a country, but then the military within that country still have things like patriotism because they've grown up and they've loyalty to that country. They'll keep fighting under the banner of that country. This is very different. These conflicts have no loyalty to the Wagner Group. Their main loyalty is to Prigozhin, which means it's very easy to take Prigozhin out, which means it's very highly unlikely that sustaining a coup would have made any ground or gotten them any leverage. Now let's compare this to the deal that we made under our side. The only response they have to the safety of the deal is they say Putin can now do whatever he wants to Prigozhin because Prigozhin now has no leverage. Notably, a claim which applies to their side if they're still one that is seeking to create a deal which reduces Prigozhin's power. But there's 3 things to note here. First, there is no need for Putin to do this, because we explained that the main threat to Putin is the Wagner Group as a whole, because it is not Prigozhin's face that overtakes Russia, it is obviously the military forces. And given that he's separated from the Wagner Group as a result of the deal, which is to say the Wagner Group are currently not in Belarus or they have been integrated back into the Russian army, you've already gotten rid of your main threat, which means Putin doesn't need to throw into resources to try and assassinate this guy. Like, he's obviously dealing with an economic crisis. He's dealing with many fronts on Ukraine. He doesn't need to do this. Secondly, we don't actually rely on the deal and the terms of the deal itself in order to mechanize why we get safety. Because we explain the fact that Putin has a lack of reliance to enter Belarus, for example, as another incentive, or the fact that, for example, the deal provided time, which meant that he could escape the borders of Russia and, for example, access foreign funds, which give him the quality of life once he has escaped. So even if Putin reneges on the deal later, this is the time that we grant for our deal that allows him to get out of the country. The later you delay this, the less time you have to do things like collect your funds before those assets are frozen. Thirdly, we explain that even if he individually doesn't have leverage, this deal is very, very important and this is the reason why Belarus negotiated, because the failing of a deal makes it harder for anyone else that wants to negotiate with Putin in the future. Fighting forces in Chechnya, satellite states like in Belarus, the remnants of the Wagner Group, who literally just threw a coup, and now their only guarantee of safety is the fact that this guy has now surrendered and they're granted an amnesty. All those people will obviously just rise up on your side if Putin suddenly decides he's going to crack down on Prigozhin again, because they know that that deal has failed, the sanctity of that deal has failed, which is why it is overwhelmingly not in Putin's interest to betray this deal. Where he is at is a good place right now. The last issue in this debate is what exactly are Prigozhin's interests? They say he's a military man, full stop. We explain this is a man who loves life. He's profit-seeking. He's been in and out of prison and worked a lot of part-time jobs. He's established restaurants, clearly a lover of food, and he's ultimately a profit-seeking mercenary. This is not a man who wanted political power. He largely opposed the military of defense because they choked his group out of resources, out of the profit that they became mercenaries in the first place. He didn't actually criticize Putin initially until Putin, at the end of the day, chose to be side with the military of defense. This is a guy who's annoyed because he's not getting paid, not a guy who wants to throw Ragnarok and take down Russia and become the next leader of Russia. This guy is not a Viking. He is somebody who really seeks profit. At the point at which we're the side that is able to guarantee safety, at the point at which we're the side that is able to access his funds, maybe this isn't the best life ever, but there are loads of dictators, there are loads of authoritarian leaders who are living in refuge, who are living in, hotels and mansions, who are living a great life. We would say that life is better than guaranteed death. For these reasons, very proud to oppose.
Thank you for that speech. We'll now call on the third affirmative speaker.
How do you go from H4 to great stuff? I just want to check, am I audible speaking like this? Yeah. Am I okay? Closer. Like that can? Can I? Can I listen to this? If David doesn't understand what an even it is, that is their problem, not ours. We gave you a selection of options that this guy had, and if he took any one that was better than this deal, that's how low our burden is to win this debate. And that's why the failure to deal with the plethora of other options, all the way until now, is going to be killing for their side, because it's too late if it comes out in camp. I want to ask two questions. First, can we get a good deal? Second, if you can't get the deal, then what? First, can we get a good deal? Again, I want to know, this is not our burden, because if we can prove that, we win by a lot. If we don't prove that, we'll win in other ways. But we give you a bunch of reasons and respond to a bunch of reasons. So I'll give direct responses because everyone says I don't give enough. First, they say there's no element of surprise on that side of the house. True, but it's also very far from Ukrainian front line to Moscow. And that's by design, because if the front line was near Moscow, Russia would be fucked, and consequently it's likely that it will take significant time to move their resources across. Then they say, but you're worried about the Ukrainian front. This is not true. First and foremost, there's minefields between the Ukrainian front and Wagner, which means that it's not like the Wagner Group is being attacked. But second, you will be a really stupid Ukrainian if you're like, the Wagner Group is fighting Russia, so I'm going to fight the Wagner Group. Presumably, you will allow that coup to play out for a bit, while steadily advancing against minimal opposition if they pull our troops. But more than that, they ignore their troops are not at the Ukrainian front. And finally, and most pertinently, they ignore the time pressure. The Ukrainians are on the counter-offensive. They are clearing the mines. They have gotten the weaponry from the west. All of that means that there is an immediate time pressure to resolve the crisis as soon as possible, so that you can get some Wagner troops back on the front lines, so that you can stop them from advancing on Russia. All of those incentives are not rebutted on their side. Then they say, the best troops are in Moscow. Look, this is factually untrue, because we know that at the start of the crisis, what they did is they put all the best paratroopers in Ukraine because they wanted to win a quick war. So what that means is that it's unlikely that these troops are there. Now, all the more, when Putin needs a win, but he's desperately scared that people will give on Russian soil, all the more likely that troops are there. But more pertinently, even if it's true that Putin is scared of internal resistance, what they tend to be scared of is a popular rebellion by the people, which is the most common way in which people have gone down. On that side, this is not a military coup. These fellows in the KGB can't do conventional warfare. They are most trained to put
put down civilian rebellion, that's a very different ball game for them to play at this point. Then they said planes. I would like to thank my military training for telling me that these planes are the fastest way you can advance because the roads are there for you, the infrastructure is there through Moscow, the likelihood of you being able to move quicker than you can move through from the Ukrainian front line all the way to Moscow is very, very significant. Then they said the MOD has weakened the Wagner Group. First, I don't think it's necessarily that weak. If they want to talk about how Prigozhin is a liar, maybe he was lying about the significant harm to the Wagner Group for the sake of political capital. But more than that, evidently they still have a significant degree of weaponry. They can take down helicopters. They haven't rebutted our analysis of how every time you take one more military camp, one more ammunition depot, there is more weapons for your side that they don't get to use against you. Especially because we started out in a camp that had not only Wagner resources, but also resources for the Russian army. Those are resources that you would have taken even before you started. But here's the killer rebuttal. In order to believe this, you have to believe that with all the planning they had to plan the coup, Prigozhin and his generals couldn't do the simplest planning. These were generals who have not gotten immunity and were unlikely to believe that they got immunity. Your military men at the top of the Wagner Group, because a lot of the Wagner Group are also people who used to be in the military, then moved to the Wagner Group. These fellas presumably on that side would have known if the coup was really going to be doomed to failure and probably wouldn't have even started this coup in the first place. So it's highly unlikely that the Wagner Group is as weak as they say. Then they said people are disenfranchised, they're not going to help you. Look, in an economic crash, with high anger against Putin, with many people having a son who died in Ukraine for no good reason, the anger against Putin is very high, such that if you sustain the rebellion, it's likely to get a momentum from the people that will come with you. That's how every revolution has worked. In 1911, that's how they put out the Qing dynasty in China. 100 years later, that's how they took down the Arab Spring. This kind of popular joining of the resistance is highly likely to occur. Then they said, it's not big enough to matter. They'll make sure that by definition it's not big enough to matter. The problem with the status quo is not one that they planned for, right? It's a Ukrainian war that they didn't expect to drag so long. It's unlikely that they were able to plan to the detail to ensure that this is small. But finally they say once Prigozhin dies, there's no more loyalty. I first want to know that the timeline picture, because he's dead, Zimbabwe's interests don't matter anymore. But more than that, there's a martyrdom effect that is equally, if not more likely to happen when somebody you love and care about dies. So that's why they got a better deal. And the only response they give is that you wouldn't want to negotiate with them. But why? This ignores the time pressure that you have to neutralize. But also, if Putin keeps fighting Wagner and Ukraine keeps advancing, there's more chance of generals, etc., losing faith in Putin and consequently the coup coming from another direction. It's a lot harder to fight defense in the summer when you're able to advance significantly more than you would in the winter. On that side of the house, it's highly likely that you'll find yourself in significant degrees of danger. Secondly, if we can't get the deal, then what? Look, Putin is going to get you guys. The only response is Belarus. This relies on the assumption that Lukashenko is lying. But why would he lie? It reduces his own relevance if he's going to lie about this on that side of the house. But also, do you really want to take the chance as an average reasonable person thinking about this, that this Lukashenko is lying? Then they say you're going to be able to get out. As if you're not being watched closely, whether you're in St. Petersburg or Belarus. Chances are the precondition of being in Belarus are that you're going to be watched closely by the Belarusian government. But here's the important thing they don't deal with. Guys, Lukashenko owes Putin. Belarus is surviving on Russian money right now. But more than that, remember when there was a coup in Belarus, or a protest in Belarus, the Belarusian army couldn't put it down. It was the Russian army that put it down. So he is a long-term requirement to be beholden to Putin. That means you don't need to invade them, guys. You just need to exert this pressure and Belarus will bow to you. So that's their mechanism taken out. Then they said there's no incentive because you've already got rid of Wagner. No response to all the material on our side again, but we told you that there's so many other potential threats that you want to silence. That example of Chechen was great for us because the last thing you want is the Chechen leader also trying to fight you. You need to put down a strong stance that shows you dare to fuck with me, you're dead. So that's why the incentive structure lines all with Putin. But finally, what safety? Because if you buy to any degree that there's a risk, and this is important, a small risk of being in prison for the rest of your life, you are highly likely to then believe that you don't want to have taken this deal because the alternative is that prison is really, really bad for you. So even if I agree that you are self-interested individual who wants to live, you don't want to live like that. And that's why they go into the alternatives because they didn't deal with us. First, as long as you have an army who is listening to you, you have leverage. You have the capacity to turn that army further against Russia. You can give them the order to back off from the Ukrainian front line or let themselves be captured rather than continue to attack them. So all of that leaves you incentive and leaves you agency, which is critical. There are businessmen who want options to scheme your way out. All of that requires to keep your army a bit longer and see what happens, which they didn't actually explain. But secondly, we told you, you can go to a third country, you can go to the West. That's all arguments that they haven't rebutted. One, there are many areas that don't have great relations with Russia who will probably harbor you. But secondly, the West is going to love you. You're not going to tell them what kind of infrastructure Russia has in the war against Ukraine. They're going to love that, and they will incentive to keep you in good witness protection. because they want to be able to attract more people to start to move to them on that side of the house. That's an alternative they haven't dealt with. But finally, most people don't fear death the most, even if they are military men. Look at, for example, trigger warning, civilians killing themselves to avoid being sexually assaulted in war. Because the average reasonable person understands that death is not the worst thing that can happen to them. Even if the average person sees like their family members dying a very painful death in hospital, they think, God, I don't want a death like that. And I think the same thing exists here. If there is even a small risk that this option, the option for Prigozhin is going to be alive in some hellish Russian prison, it is highly likely that they would not want to take that alternative instead of choosing another way out for themselves, whether it was a third country or whether it was even death. The comparative in this debate is this. We can go on and on about the relative options that Prigozhin had, but about the relative chances of Prigozhin winning the coup. But what we were pushing for was not the overthrow of Putin, and there was a straw man from that side. What we wanted was to keep our options open in order to pick the best chance for ourselves, not get COVID in 24 hours, end up trusting our entire life with Putin and hoping that the man who has reneged on every deal he's ever made was going to magically keep the deal with you. That was why we proposed.
Thank you for that speech. We'll now call on the third negative speaker.
Firstly, UN peacekeepers just backed the Mali outing, the very fact that Putin still goes after you, the very fact that Putin still tries to take you down, and the very fact that they still try to destroy your capacity to live in any meaningful way, means that this is not a viable counterfactual. The last thing to note is that they obviously cannot pretend that they can get a deal later. You march like 5 kilometers more towards Moscow and the deal somehow gets better for reasons. The first of which is that some costs already existed. The second and more important is that every single day you fight on, that is a risk of your life as an individual, which therefore means each day you wait longer to fight, the more leverage you're going to lose, and the more likely you are going to die, and that is why it is unlikely to be feasible. That is why that deal does not exist. Our deal is the best deal you could possibly get. It's a deal which protects your safety. It's a deal which means you have the best opportunity to leave. What do we hear from them? The first of which is that there are other options, like, for example, you can defect to the West. Firstly, not a mutually exclusive option, because it still does not preclude defecting to the West. If I wanted to defect in the first, if Prigozhin wants to defect anyway, he probably just could do so for all the reasons they have already given there. But the second observation I'll make is that they go, well, Lukashenko himself is really unreliable because Putin's been siphoning money into Belarus and therefore never has your interest. The first thing here is that at the point where Prigozhin chose to negotiate with Putin directly, or chose to negotiate with Lukashenko as an intermediary, it probably suggests that Lukashenko at least has some veneer of being a neutral third party, and at least has some sort of relationship with Prigozhin, such that he isn't likely to immediately whenever we deal and just chuck him off, pass him off to Putin if he wants to. But secondly, even if this was true, this is the most immaterial part of the debate, because when we talk about safety, isn't it about material safety in terms of Putin promises not to prosecute you, is the idea that we bought time to Prigozhin, because Putin is no longer on your heel, because people are kind of speculative as to what you're actually going to do and they're not going to move so soon, that gives you the opportunity for Prigozhin to flee the country in many ways. They say that Lukashenko and Belarus is going to trap you. I think at the point where the Wagner Group still has some resources, the Wagner Group still has some ability to relocate to the country, like crossing borders like Moldova or something. Those are things that still occur and allow you to flee prosecution in a way which protects them at best. What you want to hear was time, not necessarily all the other crap they wanted to talk about there. So, what else do we hear? Worst case scenario, you get your infinite Petersburg to take you away, and now prison is particularly bad. Here's a few reasons to weigh against prison. Firstly, prison being bad is obviously less worse than death. But secondly, in our absolute worst case scenario, obviously things are symmetrical because you are also likely to die there. The third thing to note here is that once you get put in prison because Putin has been making a deal, you're likely to be martyred on that hour of like no one, because this is someone who's made a deal in good faith and now something hasn't gone the way you want to, which therefore means you are more likely to see you as a martyr. In that sense, the third thing to note is that if you believe the fact that Russia is currently on the back foot and is currently going to lose the war, if you're in prison, obviously when Russia loses, you can leave prison. That's going to be a good thing, and you're going to be able to live your life eating food and being a cook, or I don't know, eating food in that sort of sense. But that's why even in our worst case scenario, it is fine. So let's say the final way we should try to win this, which is say you can have a coup. They give a few reasons to just let a coup is going to be successful. First of which is that you go along the way, you get momentum, and people start joining you. First thing, note here that even when the Wagner Group took Rostov, they were not met with adulation or popular support. It was unclear what the Russian people wanted, since the fact that maybe they go from one Taliban to another. It is incredibly unclear to me as why they even remotely have that situation. It does not offer them a way out. That is why they did not have people marching along with them all the way to the Moscow. It was just reference to the Wagner Group. The second thing they note here is there are also huge costs in marching along where you sacrifice your life for someone who's likely to be indoctrinated by Russian propaganda. You're already following groups being enabled by a traitor, deeply unclear what you worse in your position, but at worst, as an individual in Russia, you kind of just hang there and pray to God you don't get conscripted, deeply unclear as to why you have any sort of interest there. The next thing they say is that this is a rebellion, which is something which has got things going. But the problem is, if this is something which gave people hope and people were definitely sort of dissatisfaction, it is unclear as to why we haven't seen more rebellions following a deal with Prigozhin and broken to Russia. Which is to say, it doesn't really kind of be that motivating or that hopeful, you can probably see more kind of upshoots of people rebelling or taking over the towns of the Russian military if they really did hate the regime that much. Last thing they say is that you can take resources and you go along. The thing here is, you're obviously not taking every single little town and all the resources when you march to Moscow. At the point where you announce you march to Moscow, you march the whole way through because everything else is distraction. Every battle you fight is going to mean you might lose your life. This kind of situation is one which is deeply unlikely. Now it comes away. There's a few things to suggest. In the best case scenario, we even don't die. I do not think it is in Prigozhin's interest anyway, because this is a man who has not shown any political ambition. He does want to become president. Winning a coup does not suggest you will have a better life or have something which feels your interest, deeply unclear why. Secondly,
We'll now come on the negative reply speaker.
If you're not going to use it, can you turn it off? I don't think it's off. Is it off now? No.
Firstly, on life, and secondly, on death. Let's begin with life. The question you must ask yourself in this debate with respect to the life of Prigozhin after this deal is simple. Is this deal likely to be a good one or not? And obviously this is a debate where we give you a set of analytical reasons to suggest why this deal is one where Prigozhin uses the leverage already earned, and their team proposes that they perhaps could earn more leverage by continuing the war. But we would say, even in the most generous read of this debate to side affirmative, Russian councillors are not stupid. The people at the negotiating table obviously know all of this. They understand the military circumstance of the country. And what that means is that in the negotiating table between Russia and Belarus, a conversation very similar to the one we have had today has likely already occurred. One in which they have already taken into account the likelihood of a future conversion from Prigozhin, one in which they have evaluated the likelihood of that movement's success, and one in which they have already considered and evaluated the risks and written it into the deal. And what that means is if the counterfactual this affirmative team wants to defend is one in which we kind of just wait around a little bit, that is an eventuality which has already been covered, which has been accounted for in a speculative nature in a way which clearly advantages Prigozhin, in a way which tries and increases the security Russia faces in the long term. That is why life under our world is so much better. The only real response this affirmative team has then is just to say that perhaps it is the case that Putin will renege on the deal. But that never responds to the litany of material we explained to you about why Putin needs to maintain his relationship with Belarus, about why Putin has very little incentive to pursue Prigozhin after the execution of this deal. Given that, our world is one in which Prigozhin gets to live a safe, relatively secure, and highly wealthy life. The best counterfactual this side affirmative team has on this issue then is just to say that maybe Prigozhin could have defected to the West. But that is clearly a counterfactual which far benefits side negative in this debate, because David and Kat's key analysis is that our team is the one uniquely that gave Prigozhin time to make negotiations. This deal was one that was struck in the context of a war, one in which it was deeply unclear how on earth the West would be able to extract Prigozhin, one where it was deeply unclear if the West would accept the deal in the first instance. And this team never sufficiently explains why that is likely. Clearly then, life is one which is far better inside of negative. Let's move on to the second issue of death, because this is an eventuality side affirmative can only win over insofar as they explain that a further military coup is likely to succeed. And we suggest to you down the bench it probably isn't. Kat explains to you that the forces of Prigozhin are structurally incompetent in the way they act, as reflected through Ukraine. David explains they're structurally small as a paramilitary group, and I explain that the operation they have ahead of them is a difficult and arduous one. This team's only response is just to say that they can recruit civilians off the ground of Russia, as though the barrier to joining a war and military effort is not immense, as though this is not a set of soldiers who have no operational skills, or are deeply unlikely to be disloyal when they've been forcibly conscripted into the army. And that is, of course, the reason why Prigozhin stopped after a single district. The reason why Prigozhin deemed this sufficient leverage to negotiate the deal and security he wanted. Because even if you buy the best case scenario for this side affirmative team, a world in which they fight a good war, that nonetheless exposes Prigozhin to risk. A risk of being assassinated, a risk of being killed on the front line, a risk of suffering a violent and painful death. Even if you believe there is a small chance of success in this world, our team at least guarantees you the good life in a Belarusian hotel.
Thank you for that speech. We're now on the final speaker for the round. The scientific power.
This coup was honestly absurd. Prigozhin started a coup, and then in less than 24 hours, the only thing that he got out of the deal was a promise to not be prosecuted for that coup. The explanation we gave you was quite intuitive, which is that Prigozhin miscalculated, got cold feet, and got scared of Putin, and therefore agreed to a shit deal too early on, which is a better explanation than what they said, which is that this is the best deal that they could have got because clearly Prigozhin discussed this, and clearly Prigozhin was smart. If that was analysis, then no regrets debates would ever take place because all actors will make the best decision possible and we're not as smart as Prigozhin. Our case, and I want to be very clear here, our case was not and never about overthrowing Russia and overthrowing Putin and becoming a politician. All we've been saying consistently down the bench is that if Prigozhin had pushed a bit more, we would have been able to get more concessions, which would have been better for Wagner and would have put Wagner in a better position vis-a-vis the Ukraine war. This affirmative case said that this is the best deal that Wagner could have got because they said that if we push further, Wagner would have been disbanded and crushed. But the force of reality is against them because Prigozhin already pushed Putin by criticizing Putin and the generals, but he was not crushed. So this shows that Putin is in a weaker position and therefore is willing to make concessions already. But if it was true that Wagner would have been disbanded, that ship has already sailed and would have happened on their side anyways because on their side Putin is already angry and already suspicious and therefore on their side the threat of assassination also exists. But note, even if Putin was afraid of another mutiny or another coup, this fear was a lot more remote and speculative compared to the immediate and approximate fear that they would lose the Ukrainian front. And therefore, in terms of prioritization, they would first prioritize appeasing Wagner so that they don't lose the Ukrainian front, as opposed to prioritizing this abstract fear and immediately trying to clamp down on Wagner. The one term that they got out of this deal was not sufficient to guarantee the safety of Wagner troops and the safety of Prigozhin, because we told you that Putin was paranoid, held grudges, and therefore he would easily go back on this deal and risk being condemned to prison. So the one positive material they had on safety was something that was speculative at the end of this debate. They had no guarantee on that front. But in order for you to buy their claim about Wagner being disbanded, you had to buy that Russia could envision a military strategy without Wagner. But they did not illustrate this to us. Russia's economy is heavily dependent on Wagner. They make up a big part of the military strategy and the military forces of Russia. They were in key military locations. Russia was losing public support and their forces were fatigued and they were losing morale, and Ukraine's counter-offensive was gaining strength. So Russia and Putin could not crush and disband Wagner because their military strategy was so intertwined with Wagner and they did not have enough time to envision and decouple themselves from Wagner. Their argument that came out in Kent about how they could, Wagner is not effective because they could not assassinate Zelensky is proof on our side that Russia desperately needs Wagner. Because right now, with the Wagner forces, they are already not gaining much ground. Imagine how much worse this would be in a war where they had to disband Wagner and eliminate Russia. Putin did not have enough time to decouple the Russian military from Wagner on their side of the house. Under time pressure, under the time-sensitive nature of the real-time events unfolding, he would have caved in and he would have accepted and he would have given them a better deal. The actual terms that will help the Wagner troops and the Wagner individuals on the ground, things like not being folded into the Russian military, things like having Russia commit more support instead of Russia trying to choke out Wagner right now, which is the way that Russia wants to decouple itself from Wagner. So if it's the case that Russia wanted to disband Wagner, recognize that they are already doing that right now by decreasing military support for Wagner. The way for them to remain relevant was to gain assurance and gain relevance in the war again, which was to push this concession on their side of the house. It's more likely that they get disbanded in the future when Putin can take his own sweet time to decouple themselves from Wagner. If they wanted safety, they should not have started the coup in the first place. Kat then says in response that you could invade Belarus to free Prigozhin, but this was an option that was eliminated on their side of the house because the consequence of that deal was that Wagner was folded into the Russian military, which means that any ability to get future concessions to support the Wagner Group was something that was eliminated on their side of the house when they lost any capital and leverage when they agreed to this deal. There were important demands that the Wagner Group needed, and these demands were prevented the Wagner troops from being scapegoats of the war and protect Russia's interests. Prigozhin failing to push for more doomed Wagner because this was the only time he could have pushed for such things. But even if we did not get a better deal, this was not our only path to victory. We gave you a bunch of other reasons why defecting would have been a better option that was only available now as opposed to when he was blocked into St. Petersburg on their side of the house.
Thank you for that speech, and thank you everyone for the debate. We'll see you later.
Yeah, they said they were gonna give us a place. Okay, let's go.
Why